Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
Hi, this is Alex Stein, co-host of Mushin Radio on Dogworks Radio. We just completed our first storytelling season on the 1925 Serum Run. Almost 100 years later, the 1925 Serum Run is something that is still inspirational, amazing, and in many ways larger than life. We've gathered all of these episodes together on one page to make it easier for you to listen to them in order. Just go to dogworksradio.com/serumrun. That's SERUMRUN, no space, dogworksradio.com/serumrun. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to Dogworks Radio at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever it is that you go to listen to podcasts.
Start your day tomorrow with The Daily Dog with Michelle Forto, the morning podcast on Dogworks Radio. Apple Podcast reviewer Patty Christensen calls it funny, smart, and filled with all the info I want to know about dogs. I love this show. Wake up with The Daily Dog, available on Dogworks Radio on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushin Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushin Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to our daily Iditarod coverage here on Mushin Radio. You can hear us at KVRF 89.7 in the Matsu Valley here in Alaska, and online at dogworksradio.com. You can also find us on social media and just about every podcast outlet out there just by searching Dogworks Radio. And calling in is my co-host from California, Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going?
It's going great, Robert. It's raining here, which seems very odd, but maybe appropriate. It's been, as Larry Doherty said when he came in, it's been an Iditarod that had all different kinds of weather. So the trail and Mother Nature really threw everything it could at the competitors. I want to start with last night. We talked about Rule 36, and I very boldly made the assertion that they would never, or I don't think I said they would never, but I said that it tends to be the case that if mushers are traveling together, that Rule 36 is not invoked and they're not withdrawn. And I think it was very, very shortly after we recorded last night's episode that, in fact, Rule 36 was invoked, and Steve Watkins and Tara Ciccatello were both withdrawn from the race at Unalakleet.
You know, I heard that as well. I guess the reasoning being is they're just a little too far behind, like we talked last night. But did they say anything else in the press release or anything of the such?
They said that they were no longer competitive. I think the next team was 3 or 4 checkpoints ahead. So, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine on Facebook last night, and they said, well, I wish that they went back to the way it was, where they would specify an amount of time that people could be behind. And I said, well, but people, no matter how you slice it, if a musher is withdrawn because of this rule, they're going to be upset, and the race marshal is going to look like the bad guy in that situation. And I can see that if they did have the specific hours behind that people were required to be, or even if that were a guideline or a suggestion, you would still have the case where someone would say, well, this team was allowed to continue when they were 92 hours behind, and my team was only 85 hours behind, so they should be allowed to continue. So, it's one of those things where I don't think it's something that anybody likes. And we've seen in the past, there have been a couple of times where teams have been officially withdrawn from the race, and they have just opted to continue up the trail without any official support from Iditarod, but going to the various checkpoints where they had drop bags sent to, and continued. And I think in one or two cases, people actually continued all the way to Nome, even though they were no longer officially part of the race. So it's not totally unheard of that someone would officially be withdrawn, but then choose to ignore that.
Right. A couple of years ago, one of the threw quite a bit of stink about it, and I think even tried to sue Iditarod. Do you think there's any repercussions or reprimands that could happen to Iditarod after the fact? I know they're sort of their own judge and jury, so to speak, but I guess after the race, there's not much they could do about it. Is that right?
Yeah, there's really not. And I think because of the status of Iditarod as a private entity and not so much a government entity, it would be very hard to make that case against them. And perhaps more importantly, anyone who would do that would really get themselves in very bad graces with the Iditarod Trail Committee. So I don't think that's something that people really want to do. And besides, it would also probably turn the fans against them and make them seem like they were a bit of a bad sport.
Right, and I don't want to mention any names here, but as far as I know, that person has not entered Iditarod again. I wonder if that was because of that sort of stink that he raised after the fact of using this, with the Iditarod using this rule against him.
It could be. It could very well be.
So tonight we have a absolutely remarkable story about somebody that we talk a lot about here on Mushing Radio, Scott Jansen, otherwise known as the Mushin Mortician. What do you have about Scott and a rescue that he helped with, and our friend Jim Lanier?
So, Scott I've only met Scott a couple of times. He's always been incredibly nice to me. So most of what I know about Scott is his public deeds. And in one of his very first Iditarods, one of the sponsors pulled out right before the race, and there was a prize that was going to be $2,500 or $3,500. And Scott just stepped up and said, well, I will donate this. And then at the finishers banquet, he actually presented this prize in like a little miniature coffin. And he is a guy who is very, very involved with the mushing community. He started out as a sponsor, as a longtime fan, worked with Paul Gebhardt, then started mushing himself. And he had there was an incident on the trail a few years ago where he had fallen into through the ice and broke his leg, and Newton Marshall wound up staying with him until help could come. And I don't think anyone who's involved with the mushing community will forget that when the big fires happened a couple years ago, he was very publicly going up and down the highway with his dog truck, offering to help people get their dogs out who needed them. He opened up the parking lot of one of his funeral homes for people who needed a place to stay or a place for their dogs to stay. So this is someone who has always been very, very involved with the mushing community and always, putting the needs of other people ahead of himself. And this year he's scratched in his last few races, and this year he was seemingly on track to finish very solidly in the middle of the pack. And he was out of White Mountain, and he was significantly behind Jim Lanier. But apparently what happened is in an area known as the Blowhole, which is where there is, because of the geography, winds are kind of amplified. And it was apparently very, very difficult to see which way teams were going. Jim and his team got a little bit disoriented, started heading in the wrong direction towards the open water instead of back where they needed to be. He finally figured that out, turned the team around, got back to his trail, but then was starting to feel the ill effects of this and was starting to develop hypothermia. And Scott came upon his team and stayed with him. And Jim hit the emergency button on his GPS, and the Iditarod kind of mobilized and motivated to figure out the best way to get them out. And as I know a little bit, and you probably know even better than I do, with some of your training, strange things can start to happen when you start getting hypothermia. You lose the ability to think logically in some cases. You often have trouble with certain physical tasks. So Scott was there with Jim, and they managed to get to safety. There was, I believe it was Jody Bailey, I want to say, was in safety and with a snow machine, and went out and brought them back to safety. The Iditarod arranged to have a medevac unit fly them from safety to Nome. And at that point, when help had arrived, Scott really could have continued with his race, but he decided that it was more important for him to stay with Jim Lanier and make sure that Jim was okay. And sometimes when you are hurt, having someone there who is just there for, just to reassure you can be an amazing thing. So Scott, when he was in every way in a position to finish this Iditarod and finish it very well and very strongly, instead chose to stay with his friend, and therefore scratched himself. So the two of them were medevaced back to Nome. They were examined by medical professionals and were deemed to be okay, and are back with their various families and support in Nome. But it's kind of an amazing story. And I thought last night, well, the Larry Doherty story is going to be the story of the Iditarod. And then Scott goes and does this. And, I've never spoken to him about these things that he does, but it seems to me that this is someone who is just motivated to go the extra mile because he knows that he can. And that's just extraordinary in my book.
I totally agree. And what a selfless individual. He gets out there and does what he does. And like you said, so many examples of these type of deeds that he's done. And as you mentioned, very active in not only the Mushin community, but the greater Anchorage community as well. Not only is he a very successful businessman as a funeral home owner, but also very active in the local community as well. If you remember back 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer, we talked to Scott Jansen on our radio show about him doing another sort of miraculous deed on the trail. I think it was right around Rainy Pass or so. One of his dogs collapsed, and right there on the side of the trail, he gave the dog CPR and revived the dog, and then, of course, continued down the trail. And that dog recovered and became a retired sled dog, and, of course, lived out his days that way. But it's just those things that he just sort of steps into action and doesn't think anything about it. And I tell you what, Alex, I don't think he much cares about the winnings from Iditarod or the glory or the fame that may come with finishing. I just think he just wants to be out there with his friends and his dogs. And if something comes up, he's going to act on it and not give it a second thought, I think.
Absolutely. And, when it comes to looking at people in sport who can be a real role model for kids and someone that you can point to, he probably would be very embarrassed to hear this, but I think you couldn't go too far wrong if you chose him as a role model. I just want to correct one quick thing. I said it was Jody Bailey. It was actually Jesse Royer who was out on the snow machine at safety.
In the mushing circles, there's been a lot of talk about sort of a changing of the guard with the Iditarod board and what's going to happen with that after this year's race in the off season. And Scott Jansen's name has been brought up several times as sort of the potential new head of Iditarod. I don't know if that's the CEO or whatever. If the board steps down, he would be a great person that could step up and really take it by the horns and take charge. Not only would I think he provide some real great insight, but not only is he obviously an excellent musher. He's been in Iditarods for several years, even though he's scratched. But those scratches sort of come with that asterisk, meaning he's done a lot of things on the trail that have caused that, like he did today with Jim. I just think that would be a guy in whatever capacity should be on the board of Iditarod and do some great things there.
Yeah, I would agree. And he reminds me in a way of Didi Genro, because Didi always seems so devoted to the idea of the Iditarod family and the mushing family. And although I've never heard him use those exact words, it seems to me that everything that he does winds up being, sort of an embodiment of what Didi says.
Right. I don't have a vote at all for the Sportsmanship Award or the Sportsman's Award for Iditarod, but I tell you what, I think that would be my vote. I know that is an award that is voted on by their fellow mushers, and I think he would be the one that should receive that. What do you think?
Yeah, I would definitely be in favor of that. Not that I have a vote either, of that or of some kind of special award, because this is really an extraordinary thing that he did, and I think it should be recognized.
I agree. So we have one other quick story today, and it's about Anna Barrington and her husband, Andy Pohl, I believe is how you say his last name. We talked last night about a lot of times the middle to the back of the packers will travel together and, camp together and hang out at checkpoints and whatnot together. And Andy, I'm sorry, I said Anna. It's actually her twin sister, Christy. Andy and Christy are recently married, and I believe we talked a little bit about this earlier in our coverage, and I think I read in a quick article that they celebrated their 1-year anniversary on the trail this year. They had some type of dinner together, some kind of beef stew or something like that, if I remember correctly. But what a cool way to go down the trail with your rather newlywed husband, who is a rookie this year, by the way, and just making their way down the trail together. What a way to have a vacation. Some people go to Hawaii, some people go to Cancun, some people go to a national park or whatever. These guys are traveling the Iditarod Trail together. What do you think about that?
I think it's really fantastic. I've always really, really liked the Barringtons. They also have worked with Scott Jansen, because it seems that everything in this episode is going to loop back around on itself. And he was one of their earlier supporters and worked with them and helped them a lot. I know that Andy has been an essential part of their kennel operation for the past couple of years. And there's something that's kind of just purely joyful about the Barringtons, and it seems like it's pretty much been that way since they started running this race, that they just always seem to have a great attitude. Even when things are not going all that well, they always seem to be smiling. For many years, they would travel together and finish together. There was the first year they ran together, I believe that they both passed under the Burled Arch side by side holding hands. And there's just something really wonderful and amazing about that. And it's great that Andy is now a part of that joy as well.
One other quick story about Jeff King, who finished 24th this year into Nome. I read a very quick blurb this afternoon saying that he was happy out on the trail finishing right there in the middle of the pack. He's even out of the money in 24th place. They're only paying to the top 20 this year. But I think he's content maybe in his sort of new role of kind of being right there solidly in the middle of the pack and just having fun out on the trail. I think that's what it's all about with Jeff.
Yeah, and one other quick thing about the Barringtons is I've seen a couple of people today who have posted pictures of them either from Nome or from the start or the restart, and apparently Facebook is tagging the wrong twin. So there's this automatic tagging thing on Facebook, and lots of people who've posted pictures of one or the other are complaining that Facebook has been tagging the wrong Barrington, and they don't know how to go in and correct it.
I think Facebook has its hands in just about everything, and I know with the Iditarod in particular, that is one of the go-to tools these days for just about everything Iditarod. Yeah,
and especially now with many teams having a social media presence, and with actually mushers occasionally posting from the trail, and more often having their relatives post about how they're doing. I think that's going to continue, in the next few years as well.
So right now, Alex, I'm just looking at the standings. It looks like we have 30. Let's see. What are we doing here? 42 people into Nome right now. We have about 10 people left out on the trail. Everybody is in between Safety and White Mountain. So in the next 77 miles or so, everybody will be into Nome. As we mentioned last night, I believe everybody is going to finish before the banquet. Is that still your thoughts today, a day later from our last episode?
Yeah, well, especially now that they've kicked out the two stragglers, I think it's pretty clear that we'll have the last finishers will be in well before the banquet, probably by the end of the day on Saturday, I would think.
What I find really interesting, I know last night we talked about the scratches, and it's typically somewhere in that 10 to 15% range. But I'm looking at the scratch list right now, and there's only 2 rookies that scratched this year. That's a pretty amazing statistic. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think part of it is that the snow was heavier and it was slower going, so that might have been a little bit more forgiving for some of the rookies. Especially in some of the areas where traditionally it's just been very, very hairy to go through on the southern route. So I'm wondering if that might have had an effect as well.
It could have, and it could be, of course, just the consistency of training this year, the better prepared they are as mushers going into the race as rookies. It could be a number of things, but like you said, I think a lot of it has to do with the trail, and unfortunately or fortunately, and depending on the way you look at it, the race ended relatively early for some of these folks, but I guarantee just about everybody on that scratch list will be back next year or in the years to come.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about our musher profile for the evening. Who do we have on tap?
So on tap today, we have Jim Lanier, who we were talking about earlier, who is the oldest musher on the trail, oldest musher in Iditarod this year. He is 77 years old. He was born in Washington, D.C., raised largely in North Dakota, got his medical degree, and moved to Alaska in 1967 to work at a native hospital with the U.S. Public Health Service, where he was for 30 years before he retired. He started mushing in 1977. And back then, the requirements to enter the Iditarod were much less stringent. There weren't qualifying races you had to get. I believe at the time you had to have 1 or 2 Iditarod finishers who would vouch for you. And so he got that. And he says that in his first Iditarod, he got lost several times, didn't know if he was going to make it. That was back in 1979. He very famously and will tell you this very shortly after you meet him, is the only person who has competed in Iditarods in all 5 decades that the Iditarod has been running. So the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the teens now. He specializes in dogs that are white. So not Siberian Husky white, but just white dogs. So white Alaskan Huskies and other white dogs. And that's why his kennel is named the Northern Whites Kennel. He's married to the first Russian woman to finish the Iditarod in 2000, Anna Bondarenko. And he is as well the author of a book called Beyond Ophir. He is a very, very colorful and wonderful character who's entered multiple Iditarods. His longest break was he took 15 years off and then came back. He's scratched the past 4 races now, but he said that what he really wants to do is to be able to run the race in 2020. So he'll have done it in all 6 decades that the race is going on. And one of the other things that he loves doing is to mentor and help young mushers. So whenever someone is learning how to mush or wants to learn how to mush and comes and approaches him, he's one of the first people to say yes and to help them in any way that he can. And one of the people that he mentored and helped as he was coming up and learning to mush was Larry Doherty. And Larry posted a picture this afternoon of him with Jim in White Mountain. And Jim left White Mountain before Larry, and he said that the plan was that he and Jim were running not too far. He was running not too far behind Jim, and he was sort of like sweeping the trail in case anything happened and Jim needed anything. He would be right there behind him. But apparently when they got to the blowhole, the visibility was almost zero, and he said that Larry couldn't even see his leaders, and that's how he missed the fact that Jim had veered off course, and he thought that Jim was just far ahead of him. And he was very, very happy to hear that Jim had been medevaced and that Jim and Scott were okay. And, I just wanted to bring this up because there's a real sense of community among mushers. And I think for a lot of people, maybe they've heard of Scott Jansen, the Mushin Mortician, but I think Jim Lanier and Larry Doherty, for most casual fans, are names that they might not know. And yet these are 2 people who have done really amazing things. And I think it's worth spending a little bit of time to talk about them and to talk about how they really embody the spirit of what the Iditarod is, because these are 2 people who are far out of the money, who are definitely not in this for the cash. They're definitely not in this for the glory, but really just are wonderful, solid mushers. Jim Lanier is just a guy who will regale you with stories. And I'm very hopeful that he will be back again next year and keep going. There have only been a couple of people who have continued running Iditarod past the age of 77. Joe Reddington Jr. did, Colonel Norman Vaughn did, and I think Dan Seavey when he was older than that. But it is possible for someone to be in their 80s and still run the Iditarod. And I have to say, as someone who, the past couple of weeks has been feeling like I feel like I'm a lot older than I was a month ago. That gives me great hope to know that, there are still people who can do this sort of thing well up into the age when, for most people, they would be thinking about retiring and sitting on a comfortable chair and just watching TV all day. But, if you really want to, you can be out in the middle of nowhere in the Iditarod Trail with beautiful dogs in the best scenery in the world.
You know, it's such an amazing story, and it's sort of an inspiration to me. A lot of people ask me all the time, Robert, when are you going to run Iditarod? And I just turned 47 myself, and I tell people all the time, hey, there are people running in Iditarod that are 30 years older than I am. Now, of course, they've ran it many a times before me, but it gives me a little bit of hope that I still have some time to get out there on that trail and do it. If there is a man as Jim's age, and you know, of course, entering just all the time and you know, doing his thing, I think I have a little bit of a chance.
Definitely. I'm not positive that you're going to win 4 of them.
I don't think so.
But I'm also not positive that that's your goal right now. So I think it's a really, really good sign that there are people who are running Iditarod well into their 50s, 60s, and 70s.
And right, you know, just one point on that, there are a lot of mushers out there that do run their first race after retirement. You know, they've had successful careers, they have some money in the bank, and they take that nest egg, if you will, and do that bucket list, and that bucket list could turn into several Iditarods after the fact. And one name that comes to mind is a person like Cindy Abbott. You know, she had a very successful career as a professor down at one of the universities in California, and she is obviously a very adventurous woman. But well into middle age, she took on Everest and the Iditarod, and now has built a beautiful home up here in Alaska and still chasing that Iditarod dream. I think she's going to be back in the next couple of years. I just saw her mushing on the trail just a couple of days ago. She and I did a head-on pass, and you know, she always gives me a quick wave, and we say hey to each other as the dogs are going by. And it's just people like that are just great inspirations for the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Cindy's one of my favorite people just because her story is so compelling and so intriguing. And you know, the fact that she was able to go so far after she hurt herself in her first Iditarod and came back and eventually finished, it's a real accomplishment. And you know, it's easy to do. It's relatively easy. I should never say it's easy. It's relatively easy to do these difficult physical things when you're in your 20s or even early 30s. I think it gets a lot harder, and it requires a lot more perseverance as you get a little bit older. Although also, hopefully, we get a little bit wiser as we get older. So maybe that makes up for it a little bit.
Very good. Anything else, Alex, for today? We have 2 more days of coverage here on our daily coverage of the 2018 Iditarod.
Just want to remind people to hit us up on social media if there is stuff, if you have comments, criticisms, questions, possible show topics. We are around on social media a lot. We're very active on Facebook. I'm relatively active on Twitter at Coldfoot Films, and Robert is at Robert Forto, and we are very responsive to people who get in touch with us. So please don't feel like you need to hesitate.
Very good. Alex, hang on for just a second after we close, please. This is Robert Forto on behalf of my co-host, this is Robert Forto on behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein. We will see you guys tomorrow night here on Mushing Radio. Goodbye.
Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can take a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all of our DogWorks Radio sponsors and promotions in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook, like our Facebook page, And one last thing, please tell all of your friends by spreading the word about DogWorks Radio. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
DogWorks Radio is produced by Robert Forto. Logo art by Angry Squirrel Studios. DogWorks Radio is produced in conjunction with KVRF 89.7 in Palmer, Alaska.
For dog training advice, you can contact Alaska DogWorks at 907-841-1686 or visit their website at alaskadogworks.com. If you have a show idea or would like to be a guest, please contact us by sending an email to live@dogworksradio.com.